In the vast expanse of Montana's wilderness, a legendary cowboy encounters the wild stallion he thought he'd lost forever. What begins as a heartwarming reunion quickly transforms into a shocking revelation that will change everything he believed about his family's ranch. The truth hidden beneath decades of silence is about to surface, and the bond between man and horse holds the key to uncovering a mystery that threatens to destroy everything he holds dear. Jake Morrison had spent 43 years working the same stretch of Montana rangeland, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. The Morrison Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of rolling hills and endless sky, where cattle grazed beneath the watchful eyes of cowboys who understood that this land demanded respect. Jake's weathered hands told the story of countless seasons spent mending fences, breaking horses, and fighting the elements that could make or break a ranching family in a single harsh winter. It was on a crisp October morning, with frost still clinging to the prairie grass, that Jake first spotted the silhouette on the distant ridge. The horse stood motionless against the amber sunrise, its black coat gleaming like polished obsidian. Even from a mile away, Jake's heart recognized what his eyes couldn't quite believe. The distinctive white blaze down the stallion's face, the proud arch of its neck, the way it held its head high against the wind. It was Thunder, the wild Mustang he had captured and trained 7 years ago. Thunder had been more than just another horse to Jake. In a world where technology was slowly creeping into ranch life, where his own son preferred video games to horseback riding, Thunder had represented something pure and untamed. Jake had spent months earning the stallion's trust, teaching him to respond to the gentlest touch of the reins, to work alongside the ranch's cattle dogs with intelligence that bordered on human. Then, one autumn night much like this one, Thunder had simply vanished. The pasture gate had been left open, and by morning, the stallion was gone. Jake had searched for weeks, following hoofprints that led to rocky ground where the trail disappeared, calling Thunder's name until his voice was hoarse. Eventually, he had accepted that some wild things were meant to stay free. But now Thunder was back, standing on that ridge as if he had never left, as if 7 years was merely a brief absence. Jake's pulse quickened as he urged his current mount, a reliable quarter horse named Dusty, toward the ridge. As they climbed the gentle slope, Jake's mind raced with questions. Where had Thunder been all these years? Why had he returned now? And more puzzling still, the stallion looked exactly the same, not a day older, his coat as lustrous as ever, his bearing still proud and strong. It was as if time had simply stopped for Thunder while the rest of the world aged around him. When Jake reached the ridge, Thunder didn't flee as a truly wild horse would. Instead, the stallion turned to face him, dark eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed to pierce straight through to Jake's soul. There was recognition there, but also something else, something that made Jake's skin crawl with unease. Thunder took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough for Jake to see his own reflection in those liquid brown eyes. The stallion lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but as if he were trying to communicate something urgent, something that Jake needed to understand but couldn't quite grasp. The wind picked up, carrying with it a scent that seemed familiar yet wrong, and Jake felt the first stirring of a fear he couldn't name. Thunder's return created a ripple effect across the Morrison Ranch that Jake hadn't anticipated. The other horses grew restless in Thunder's presence, their usual calm demeanor replaced by nervous energy that had them pacing their paddocks and whinnying at shadows. The cattle, normally docile and predictable, began clustering together in tight groups, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if watching for some unseen threat. Even the ranch dogs, bred for courage and loyalty, seemed uneasy around the returned stallion, their hackles rising whenever Thunder appeared. Jake's wife, Sarah, noticed the change in her husband immediately. For 40 years of marriage, she had watched Jake work with horses, had seen him gentle the wildest mustangs with patience and skill. But with Thunder, something was different. Jake spent hours simply standing near the stallion, not attempting to rope or bridle him, but studying him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. When Sarah brought Jake his afternoon coffee, she found him staring at Thunder with the same expression he'd worn when their daughter Emma had been diagnosed with leukemia 15 years ago, a mixture of hope and desperate fear. "He hasn't aged a day," Jake murmured to Sarah one evening as they watched Thunder graze near the creek that ran along the northern boundary of their property. 7 years, and he looks exactly the same. "Horses don't work that way, Sarah. Nothing works that way." Sarah squeezed her husband's weathered hand, feeling the tension in his muscles. She had learned long ago that the land held secrets, that sometimes the prairie whispered truths that rational minds couldn't accept. Her grandmother had been part Cherokee, and the old woman had filled Sarah's childhood with stories of spirit animals and ancient guardians who watched over the land and its people. The mystery deepened when Jake discovered that Thunder wasn't alone. Following tracks in the soft earth near the creek, Jake found evidence of other horses, at least a dozen, possibly more. The hoofprints were unusual, deeper than they should have been for the size of the horses, and they seemed to follow patterns that made no sense for wild animals seeking water and grass. Instead, the tracks formed intricate designs in the earth, almost like symbols or messages written in a language Jake couldn't read. Local rancher Tom Henderson stopped by the Morrison place 3 days after Thunder's return, his face grave with concern. Tom's property bordered the Morrison Ranch to the east, and his family had worked the land for just as long. "Jake," Tom said, his voice low and urgent, "my grandmother's been having those dreams again. You know, the ones about the horses that aren't really horses, about the guardians who protect something buried deep beneath our feet." Jake felt his blood run cold. Tom's grandmother was 97 years old and had been having prophetic dreams since childhood, dreams that more often than not proved to be warnings of events yet to come. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, looking out across the moonlit pastures where Thunder grazed peacefully among the shadows. As Jake watched, other shapes began to emerge from the darkness, the mysterious horses whose tracks he had found by the creek. They moved with an otherworldly grace, their coats seeming to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. And as they gathered around Thunder, Jake realized that his beloved stallion was not just a horse who had returned home. Thunder was their leader, and they'd all come back for a reason that Jake was only beginning to understand. The wind carried the sound of their hoofbeats, but the rhythm was wrong. Too steady, too purposeful, like the beating of a great heart deep beneath the earth. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning when Jake found his grandfather's old journal hidden in the bottom drawer of the ranch office desk. He had been searching for property deeds, trying to research the history of the northern pasture where Thunder and his mysterious companions had been gathering each night. The leather-bound book was wrapped in oilcloth, its pages yellowed with age and filled with his grandfather's careful handwriting. As Jake read, his hands began to tremble, and the comfortable world he had known for 43 years began to crumble around him. According to the journal, the Morrison family had not simply inherited the ranch from earlier settlers. They had been chosen as guardians, selected by forces that his grandfather referred to only as the ancients, the land beneath. The Morrison Ranch was sacred ground, a burial site for a Native American tribe that had vanished mysteriously over 2 centuries ago. But they hadn't simply died or moved away. They had transformed themselves into something else, something that could protect their sacred sites for eternity. The horses weren't horses at all, but spirit guardians, the transformed souls of warriors and shamans who had chosen to remain bound to the earth rather than pass into the afterlife. Jake's grandfather wrote about a pact made in 1892 when the first Morrison had settled the land. The spirits had appeared to his great-grandfather in the form of wild horses, led by a magnificent black stallion with a white blaze. They had offered a bargain. The Morrison family could work the land and prosper, but they must also serve as protectors, ensuring that the sacred sites remained undisturbed and that the ancient burial grounds were never desecrated by mining development or careless ranching practices. In return, the spirit horses would watch over the family, bringing good fortune to their cattle and protection from the harsh elements of the Montana wilderness. Each generation of Morrisons had maintained this covenant, but Jake's father had never spoken of it directly. Instead, he had simply taught Jake to respect the land, to avoid certain areas during specific times of year, and to pay attention to the messages that the horses might bring. Jake realized now that many of his father's seemingly arbitrary rules about ranch management had actually been designed to honor the ancient agreement. The northern pasture, where Thunder now gathered with his companions each night, was one of the most sacred sites, a place where the transformation ceremonies had taken place centuries ago. But the journal revealed something more disturbing. The spirit horses only appeared when the sacred sites were in danger, when some threat to the ancient burial grounds required their intervention. Jake's blood ran cold as he read his grandfather's account of the last time the horses had manifested en masse in 1934, just before a mining company had attempted to drill exploratory wells near the creek. That attempt had ended in disaster, with equipment failures, accidents, and mysterious illnesses forcing the company to abandon their plans. The horses had disappeared once the threat was resolved, fading back into the spirit world until they were needed again. As Jake finished reading the journal, the implications hit him like a physical blow. Thunder's return wasn't a joyful reunion. It was a warning. Something was threatening the sacred sites, something that required the intervention of the spirit guardians. Jake's mind raced as he tried to identify the threat. The ranch had been operating the same way for decades, but recently there had been changes. His son Michael had been pushing for modernization, talking about new irrigation systems, expanded mineral rights leasing, and development opportunities that could bring additional income to the struggling ranch. Jake realized with growing horror that Michael had been in contact with surveying companies and geological consultants, preparing for projects that would involve extensive drilling and excavation across the very areas that his family had been sworn to protect. The confrontation with his son Michael came that evening at dinner, and it shattered the fragile peace that had held the Morrison family together through years of financial struggle. Michael, 32 years old and fresh from agricultural college, had returned to the ranch with modern ideas and impatient dreams of prosperity. When Jake showed him the journal and tried to explain the family's ancient obligations, Michael's reaction was immediate and dismissive. "Dad, you can't be serious," Michael said, his voice heavy with the condescension of youth faced with what it perceived as superstition. "We're talking about ghost horses now? Some kind of mystical contract with dead Indians? This ranch is failing, and you want me to base business decisions on a book of fairy tales written by a man who lived in the 19th century?" Sarah watched helplessly as the two men she loved most engaged in a battle that seemed to have been brewing for years. Michael had never felt the connection to the land that flowed through Jake's veins like blood. To Michael, the ranch was a business investment, a collection of assets that needed to be optimized for maximum profit. The proposed irrigation system would require deep wells drilled precisely through the heart of the sacred burial grounds. The mineral rights lease would bring heavy machinery and excavation that would disturb sites that had remained untouched for centuries. And the development project, a luxury guest ranch that would cater to wealthy city dwellers seeking an authentic Western experience, would transform the northern pasture into a recreational facility complete with buildings, roads, and utilities. That night, as the family argument echoed through the ranch house, the spirit horses gathered in greater numbers than Jake had ever seen. Thunder led them in what could only be described as a ceremony, their movements creating intricate patterns in the moonlit grass. The other ranch horses grew increasingly agitated. breaking through fence rails and gathering near the house as if seeking protection from some invisible threat. The cattle began a low, continuous lowing that raised the hair on Jake's arms and sent chills down his spine. Even the coyotes and wolves that normally called across the prairie fell silent, as if the very wildlife recognized that something momentous was building in the darkness. Jake spent the sleepless hours before dawn walking the boundaries of his property, trying to understand what the spirits expected of him. The journal had been clear about the Morrison family's role as guardians, but it had been less specific about what should happen if a member of the family chose to break the covenant. As Jake stood in the northern pasture, surrounded by the ghostly forms of the spirit horses, he felt the weight of 2 centuries pressing down on him. These weren't just ancient burial sites. They were the final resting places of people who had loved this land so deeply that they had chosen to remain bound to it even after death. Their sacrifice demanded respect, demanded protection, demanded a level of commitment that his son seemed incapable of understanding. Thunder approached Jake in the pre-dawn darkness, the stallion's dark eyes reflecting starlight like pools of liquid obsidian. As Jake reached out to touch the horse's neck, he felt a jolt of energy that seemed to connect him directly to the spirits themselves. In that moment, he experienced flashes of memory that weren't his own, images of the original inhabitants of this land, their ceremonies and their love for the earth that sustained them, their decision to transform rather than abandon the places where their ancestors were buried. Jake saw the mining disasters, the droughts that had struck ranches that violated the sacred sites, the prosperity that had blessed families who honored the ancient agreements. But he also saw something else, something that made his heart race with fear. The spirits were growing weaker, their ability to protect the sacred sites diminishing as the modern world pressed in around them. Industrial development, climate change, and the gradual loss of people who understood the old ways were eroding their power. Thunder, as return, wasn't just a warning about Michael's development plans. It was a desperate plea for help from beings who had devoted their eternal existence to protecting something precious that was now in danger of being lost forever. Jake realized that he wasn't just facing a family crisis or a business decision. He was standing at the crossroads between the ancient world and the modern one, and the choice he made would determine not only the fate of his ranch, but the survival of guardians who had protected this land for over 200 years. The crisis reached its breaking point when surveyors arrived at the ranch 3 days later, their equipment trucks rumbling across the cattle guard, despite Jake's explicit instructions that no work was to begin until family matters were resolved. Michael had called them anyway, his frustration with his father's superstitious nonsense driving him to take unilateral action. As the surveying team began setting up their equipment near the creek, the spirit horses materialized in broad daylight for the first time since Jake had been keeping watch. The surveyors saw them too, their professional confidence evaporating as Thunder and his companions emerged from what appeared to be empty air. The horses moved with purpose toward the surveying equipment, their hooves striking the ground with impacts that sent vibrations through the earth. The electronic instruments began malfunctioning immediately, GPS units displaying impossible coordinates, metal detectors screening with readings that made no sense, and laser levels refusing to maintain calibration. One surveyor, a veteran with 30 years of experience, dropped his equipment and backed toward the trucks, his face pale with terror as he stared at horses that seemed to shimmer and shift like mirages, even in the clear light of day. Jake arrived at the scene to find chaos. The surveyors were packing their equipment with shaking hands, talking in urgent whispers about optical illusions and electromagnetic anomalies. Their team leader, a practical man who prided himself on scientific rationality, kept glancing over his shoulder at the spirit horses as if expecting them to vanish or attack. "We can't work here," he told Jake, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "I don't know what kind of phenomenon you've got on this land, but our equipment won't function properly. We're going to need specialized consultants, maybe atmospheric scientists or geologists who understand unusual magnetic fields. Michael arrived 15 minutes later, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He had heard the surveyor's report over his truck radio, and his humiliation at having his development plans derailed by what he still refused to acknowledge as supernatural forces had driven him to a rage that Jake had never seen before. "This is ridiculous," Michael shouted, his voice carrying across the pasture. "These are just horses, Dad. Wild horses that you've anthropomorphized into some kind of mystical guardians. I'm not going to let family mythology destroy our chance to save this ranch from bankruptcy." The confrontation that followed was witnessed by both the terrified surveyors and the spirit horses themselves. Michael grabbed a rifle from his truck, his intentions clear, even before he spoke them aloud. "If these horses are the problem," he said, his hands trembling as he chambered around, "then we solve the problem by getting rid of them. They're just animals, and this is our land." Jake stepped between his son and Thunder, his heart pounding as he realized that 32 years of love and guidance had failed to teach Michael the most important lesson of all, that some things were more valuable than money, and some agreements were too sacred to break. Thunder stood motionless as Michael raised the rifle, the stallion's dark eyes fixed not on the weapon but on Jake himself. In that moment, Jake understood that this was the test, the moment when the Morrison family's commitment to their role as guardians would be proven or destroyed forever. The other spirit horses had formed a circle around the confrontation, their ethereal forms becoming more solid and defined with each passing second. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension, and Jake could feel the weight of 2 centuries of his family's promises pressing down on him like a physical force. Sarah's voice cut through the silence like a blade, her words carrying the authority of 40 years of marriage and the wisdom of a woman who understood that some battles were worth fighting even if they tore families apart. "Michael Morrison," she called from the ranch house porch, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You put that gun down right now, or you're no son of mine. Your great-grandfather made a promise on this land, and we've prospered because of it. You want to destroy that for money? Then you can find yourself another family, because this one honors its commitments." The rifle wavered in Michael's hands as he looked from his mother to his father to the magnificent stallion who had somehow become the focal point of everything his family believed in. The next few seconds would determine not only the fate of the Morrison ranch, but the survival of guardians who had protected sacred ground for longer than any living person could remember. The resolution came not through violence, but through a moment of understanding that transformed Michael's perception of everything he thought he knew about his family's legacy. As he stood with the rifle in his hands, staring into Thunder's eyes, Michael experienced what his grandfather's journal had described as the awakening, a sudden, overwhelming connection to the spiritual history of the land that ran deeper than blood or money or modern ambitions. Thunder stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the gun until the barrel was almost touching his forehead. The stallion's eyes never left Michael's face, and in that prolonged moment of contact, Michael saw what Jake had seen during his midnight encounter with the spirit horses. He witnessed the original ceremonies, felt the love that the ancient people had held for this earth, understood the magnitude of their sacrifice in choosing to remain as guardians rather than passing peacefully into the afterlife. He saw the prosperity that his family had enjoyed for 5 generations, the protection that had kept them safe through droughts, blizzards, economic downturns, and personal tragedies that had destroyed other ranching families. The rifle slipped from Michael's nerveless fingers, falling to the grass with a soft thud that seemed to echo across the entire ranch. As the weapon hit the ground, the spirit horses began to fade, their forms becoming translucent as the immediate threat to the sacred sites diminished. But Thunder remained solid, real, his presence a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits who had chosen eternal guardianship over eternal rest. Over the following weeks, the Morrison family worked together to develop a new plan for the ranch's future, one that honored both their financial needs and their spiritual obligations. Michael's agricultural training proved invaluable as they designed sustainable ranching practices that would generate income without disturbing the sacred sites. They established a conservation easement on the northern pasture, legally protecting the burial grounds from future development while qualifying for tax benefits that helped stabilize their finances. The failed surveying expedition became a blessing in disguise as the consultants' reports of unusual electromagnetic phenomena attracted the attention of universities interested in studying the area for legitimate scientific research, bringing rental income from researchers who treated the land with appropriate respect. Sarah began documenting the family's history with the spirit horses, working with local tribal leaders to ensure its were preserved accurately and respectfully. Her research revealed that several other ranching families in the region had similar agreements with spiritual guardians, creating a network of protection that had preserved sacred sites across thousands of acres of Montana rangeland. These families began meeting regularly, sharing knowledge and coordinating their stewardship responsibilities in ways that their ancestors had never been able to achieve. Thunder remained on the ranch, no longer wild but not quite domesticated either, existing in the liminal space between worlds that he had always occupied. Jake found that he could work alongside the stallion in ways that defied ordinary understanding of human-animal relationships. Thunder seemed to know instinctively which cattle needed attention, which areas of the ranch required maintenance, and when weather changes would affect their operations. The partnership between man and spirit horse became a source of wonder for visitors and a reminder to the Morrison family that they were participants in something much larger than ordinary ranching. As autumn returned to the Montana plains, Jake stood once again on the ridge where he had first spotted Thunder after 7 years of absence. The other spirit horses were barely visible now, watchful presences that appeared only when the light was just right or when the wind carried whispers of ancient ceremonies. Jake understood now that Thunder's return had been about more than protecting sacred sites. It had been about teaching a new generation of Morrisons to see beyond the immediate challenges of modern life and recognize their role in a story that began long before they were born and would continue long after they were gone. The bond between the Morrison family and the spiritual guardians of the land was stronger now than it had ever been, rooted not just in ancient agreements, but in a profound understanding of what it meant to be true stewards of the earth and protectors of its sacred mysteries.